In our last video, we talked about how to calculate board feet, what is board feet, and how do we use it to calculate the cost of lumber. And so in this video, we're going to apply all of those skills to figure out and estimate the cost of a particular project. And through this exploded view, we can see all the different parts and components that make up the breakfast tray. So our very first step when we're trying to estimate the cost of this project is to create a parts list. Now remember, if the piece of wood that we're talking about is a different size or it's a different type of wood, it is considered a different part, which means it would need to have a separate entry on our parts list. So let's start and catalog all of these parts into our parts lists over here. I'm going to start with these blue pieces over here. And so when you're running down the parts list, we usually give it a letter for easy reference. So I'm going to call that A, and that A would correspond to the actual pictures in the diagram. So since these are going to be my A's, I'm going to call this part A. I'm going to call this part A, and I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. So I'm just going to call them box bottoms. Okay, we're going to figure out our length in inches. And so the length is right down here. That's 15.5. The width is 4.25. And the thickness is actually indicated here. All pieces are 1/2 inch thick. QTY is short form for quantity, so how many of these same parts exist in the picture. So these two are the same size, and so there's 2 of them. Now if we're moving down the column, I could pick any other part for my next one. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to make this one my B part. And there's its matching cousin. So I'm going to label those B on my diagram. Give it the new letter, and I'll call it the handles. That's a logical name. All right, again, we're going to figure out the length, and this is where you need to look very carefully at the diagram to see what's the actual true length. We see that there's 2 numbers, 8.5 and 9.5, and I've zoomed in a little bit closer. And as you can see, the 8.5 is referring to this point here and this point over here. And so it doesn't actually incorporate this lip over here, nor does it incorporate this lip. Whereas 9.5 actually goes from this point to this point, which is the full length of the piece. So actually, my length of my handles is 9.5 inches and not 8.5. Look very carefully at what the dimensions are pointing to. Thankfully, width is a lot simpler. From this point to this point, it's 5.5 inches. And even though there's a curve, that's irrelevant because we're measuring the widest point, because we would need to cut a 5.5 inch wide piece on the table saw, and then we would run this curve on the belt sander or on the bandsaw. But regardless, we would still need a piece that's at least 5.5 inches wide. And finally, our thickness. All pieces are 1/2 inch thick. And there are 2 pieces. 1, 2. We need to make 2 handles at this particular size. Let's move on to our next one, which is C. And I'm going to name these orange pieces C. I'm going to call them sides. And again, we need to figure out our length. Now, if we're looking at this piece, we can see that there are 2 dimensions. And let's glance and take a look at what they're measuring. So we've got 15.5, and it's referring to these 2 corners. And well, that's not going to be right because we need to also know what the distance of these lips are, right? There's this lip here, and this lip here, and this dimension doesn't account for that. So let's look down to our next one. And this one says it's 14 and a half. And at first that doesn't make any sense, but then we can take a look and see that this dimension and this dimension is actually referring to this purple strip, which we'll worry about later. Since the dimensions are not on this piece over here, I'm going to see if the dimensions are on its matching cousin, which is over here. And yes, it does, because we can see that this black dimension line corresponds from this corner to this corner, which is the longest part of the piece of wood. So this is actually my dimension, 16 and a half. When we're figuring out our width, we look at this here for a second, and we realize that 2 and 2, that's actually referring to the distance of this lip here and the distance of this lip here. So we're going to ignore these dimensions. And let's go back to its other piece, and yes, 4 inches from this point to this point. And again, 1/2 inch thick. And there's 2 of these pieces. Now, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to name this D. And I'm going to name this part D. I'm going to name this red piece E. And the red piece here as well will also be E. D and E. I'll call the D piece the long cleat. I'm going to call the red piece short cleat. Now go ahead and pause the video and see if you can fill this in yourself. All right, at this point, this should be your answer. The length was indicated earlier, 14 and a half. If you're struggling to figure out where the width is, the width is actually right over here. It's listed over here. Thickness is listed here. And as for the short cleat, same thing. The length is listed here, and the width is listed here. And there's 2, one here and one that's hiding over here. Now that we have our parts list, we can put this away for now. We can refer just to our chart.
And let's calculate board feet.
Now to figure out the board feet and the cost of this entire project, it's really just a bunch of steps. And so we're going to repeat these steps for each of the parts. So I'm going to focus on just part A. And the very first step is to figure out the board feet for just one of part A. And so remember, we're just looking at one of them, not 2 of them. So we'll start by writing our formula. So board feet is length in inches times width in inches times thickness in inches divided by 144. So that's the nice thing about this, because we can just actually run down our chart over here. So length is 15.5. 4 1/4 is the width, so that is 4.25. And the thickness is 1/2 inch, or 0.5. We would multiply all of these and divide it by 144. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my calculator. 15.5 times 4.25 times 0.5 gives me this number over here. We're going to divide that by 144. And that gives me 0.28 board feet. So I'm just going to round that up, and I'm going to call that 0.23. Now remember, our figure here, 0.23 board feet, only calculates one of the box bottoms, or one of the part A's. And so as a result, we need 2 of them. So our next part is to figure out how many board feet are needed to make all of the part A's. So right now, one part A is 2.3 board feet, and we need 2 of these, so we just simply multiply it by 2. And that gives us 0.46 board feet. Now, just so I don't forget, I'm going to take this and just write this next to my parts list. All right, and so let's put this all together as we try this again for figuring out the board feet needed for all the handles. Now, when you're doing an assignment, very important to read the question carefully. So, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to figure out the board feet for one of the handles, and then I'm just going to go ahead and multiply it by 2. So, here's the formula. And I'm going to plug in the numbers. So 9.5 is 9.5. 5.5 is 5.5. Half inch, 0.5. Divided by 144. That comes to 26.125. We're going to take all of that and divide it by 144. And that gives us this number here. I'm just going to round to the nearest hundredth. So that's 0.18. Now remember, this is just for one of those pieces, and since there are 2 of these, I'm going to need to multiply this by 2. So 0.18 board feet times 2 is 0.36 board feet. So that is the amount of board feet needed for all the handles. I'm going to go ahead and write that down there. Now at this point, I would encourage you to pause the video, use this formula, and figure out the board feet needed for all the sides, all the long cleats, and all the short cleats. So go ahead and pause the video and try that yourself. All right, so now you should have something like this, or numbers that are relatively close to what I've got over here. Now, we're really close. What is the total board feet of the entire project? So really, to solve that, we would just simply add all of the numbers here. So here's your equation, and then you just add them all up, and that would give you 1.53 board feet, and so that is the sum of all of these pieces over here. Now, truthfully, if you went to the store and you bought 1.53 board feet of wood, and then you started to run it through the jointer and run it through the planer to try to create these parts, you would find yourself short. You would not have enough wood to make these parts, because what we've calculated is the final dimension of all these parts. We haven't actually accounted for waste. So let's factor in waste to this number now. So now let's account for 30% waste. So now to solve this problem, accounting for 30% waste, how much board feet do we actually need for the entire project? So essentially, to solve that, we would need to know the amount of board feet for the entire project, which we already have here, plus we need to add 30% waste. Now, just in case you're curious, this 30% over here would include things like adding an extra inch or 2 when you're cutting it off on the radial arm saw. It would also include waste from the jointer and the planer as you're getting a flat face and a flat reference edge, and also ripping that last edge on the table saw to get it nice and smooth. So that waste is essentially machine waste. So to figure out the amount of waste, we're going to need to find 30% of 1.53 board feet. So 1.53 board feet. Now we're going to convert 30% into decimal form. So if you convert it into decimal form, you will get 0.30 or 0.3. Then you would just multiply these two numbers. So 1.53 times 0.3 is 0.459 board feet. I'm just going to round it to the nearest hundredth. So 0.46 board feet of waste. So this is 30% waste. So to figure out how much board feet is needed for the entire project, all I would do is take 1.53, which is the amount of wood needed for the entire project, and add in my 0.46 board feet of waste. Add the two together, and you'll get 1.99 board feet. Now, truthfully, you can't go to the lumber yard and ask for 1.99 board feet because it's sold by board foot, so you would simply ask for 2 board feet. Now, in this example, if your final project required 3.1 board feet, as I mentioned, you actually can only buy wood by the board foot. So you can either settle for 3 board feet or 4 board feet. So in this case, you'd actually have to buy 4 board feet. Or you could just shrink your dimensions to try to get 3 board feet. Now my client, Jimmy, wants this entire tray made out of Cocobolo. He's obsessed with Cocobolo. And that costs $65 per board foot. And so to figure out the cost, I would take the cost, which is $65 per board foot, and multiply it by the board feet needed for the project. And again, when you're picking the two numbers, you should definitely pick the one that accounts for the waste. So that's this one, 2 board feet. And 65 times 2. And 65 times 2 is $130. So to make this entire project out of Cocobolo, it would cost $130. And so in summary, these are the board feet for the individual parts. And if we add them all up, we would get this figure over here, which is the total board feet. However, we need to account for waste. So after we add 30% waste, we will get 1.99 board feet. And of course, if I actually have to go to the store and buy it, I would need to buy 2 board feet because there's no such thing as 1.99 board feet. All right. Thanks for watching and all the best.